everyone. So today we are going to be talking about temperance. I'd like you to start with your right into the day, which is a word web. In the center, you'll see that there's problems progressive reformers were trying to solve, and I want you to, on the end of each of the lines, to put one of the problems that progressive reformers were trying to solve. This should be review. We did study this when we were talking about the muckrakers and when we were creating the Muckraker magazine. So please take a minute and do that before moving on to the next part of the video. Today we will review the start of the progressive era because it's been a while since we've been in class, and we will also examine the events that led to the temperance and women's suffrage movement, as well as how the two are linked. So let's start with some review. Americans were looking to create change because they were tired of the corruption. Remember, we are in the time period of the Gilded Age, which is when things are looking good on the outside, but on the inside they're actually very corrupt. So during the Gilded Age, businesses are monopolizing, products are very expensive, and the average American worker is not making enough money to support themselves. Additionally, the movement begins after the Gilded Age kind of ends. They kind of overlap a little bit. And the movement begins to create change in America, and that is called the Progressive Movement or the Progressive Era. And we've already learned about some of the people from the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is the time in American history where people were trying to make changes. They wanted the government to get involved in business and an end to laissez-faire politics. Remember, laissez-faire means hands-off government, which is when the government did what they wanted to do while businesses were doing what they wanted to do, and they weren't getting involved with each other. Businesses were to treat workers and consumers fairly, and they wanted Americans to be informed of what was going on. To fight this, many workers formed labor unions or organizations that fought to protect the average American worker. And we've already seen some of those labor unions like the American Federation of Labor, International Workers of the World, Knights of Labor, so on and so forth. But these are the organizations that were created and designed to help the average American worker who was being taken advantage of during the Progressive Era. We've definitely spent some time with muckrakers and reformers, and we've talked about the different muckrakers, and we've seen the different things that muckrakers have done. The people who are trying to make change at this time in U.S. history were called muckrakers and reformers. A muckraker is someone that digs up dirt and then shares it to others. So essentially, they're the ones who are trying to find the corruption and then are letting everybody know about it. So often muckrakers would be journalists or writers, and they would spread the scandal that they learned about through written works. So we'd see in newspapers, in books, in articles, in magazines, there were people who were muckrakers that were posting different events that were happening that were not so good to the American workers. A reformer, on the other hand, is a person who makes changes in order to improve something. Some reformers, examples could be Teddy Roosevelt, because he had some form of power. And it's hard to be a reformer because you really need to have power to be a reformer, to make that change or reform. So now we're going to get into learning a new material, which is about temperance and women's suffrage. Today we're really going to be focusing on temperance and what that means and how that ties into the women's suffrage movement. So women in society so far. Before the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, women were seen as property, so kind of like slaves, except for women did have more rights than slaves. However, they belonged to their husbands and to their fathers. If their father was dead, they would belong to maybe a grandfather, maybe an uncle. They weren't allowed to have their own beliefs and their own opinions. They were designed to be kind of like property. Upper class women were able to be educated because they could afford it. Now, some lower class were also able to be educated, but when you think about the average everyday American worker, most of the children and women were also involved in the workforce and were working in the factories. Some women did try to fight for rights before the Progressive Era. However, there was little success up to this point. So, what is temperance, and how does temperance have to do with women's rights? So temperance is when you don't drink alcohol. And the Temperance Movement was a time when Christian women were fighting to ban alcohol from the United States. So how are women's rights and fighting to ban alcohol connected? Let's get into that. As the United States developed, people started turning from light alcoholic beverages such as beer and hard cider to stronger beverages like rum and whiskey as they became cheaper. This led to what is known as an epidemic of alcoholism. People, in this case mostly men, because they're mostly the ones who are going to be buying alcohol, were becoming addicted to alcohol. Many educated women felt that many of society's greatest disorders could be traced to alcohol. According to their view, alcohol led to increased domestic violence and neglect. So women were coming together against alcohol because they noticed that their husbands would go out and drink, and then they would come home and abuse them and take advantage of them. Also, they would go and they would spend all of their money on alcohol instead of spending money on things for the family. So a lot of women were upset about this, and they decided to start lobbying for it. And when you lobby for things, that means that you're going and you're fighting to try and make a change. Here is an example of a political cartoon. And what I want you to do is I want you to look at this political cartoon, and I want you to answer those questions, the observe, reflect, and question. Remember, when we observe, we are looking at the document, kind of stating what we literally see. Are there important words? In this case, at the bottom, which you might not see, because I don't know if my screencast is set up properly, but it says, Scene 2D. He is discharged from his employment for drunkenness. They pawn their clothes to supply the bottle. And you'll also see this in your notes packet as well. So when we observe, we're pulling out important words, important details. When we reflect, we're really diving deep into the cartoon and thinking about it and considering how this would be different if it were today, or thinking about how this might mean something or what it means and how it's related to what we've already learned about in history. Any of those can be examples of reflect. And then question is obviously when you question things. So I'll give you a few minutes to do this one as well as the next one, and then you can continue forward. For this cartoon, it's really difficult to make out the words on the bottom, but it says something about violence is the natural consequence of the frequent use of the bottle. I don't really know what it says in the beginning, but it's saying that violence is a natural consequence of frequent use of the bottle, meaning that violence is a problem associated with alcohol. So again, you're going to observe, reflect, and question, and then we'll move on to the next. Okay, so the Temperance Movement. Upper-class Christian women were tired of being abused, so they continued to rally for temperance. Eventually, they succeeded with the passage of the 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture or creation, sale, and transportation of alcohol. This time period where alcohol was banned in the United States is also called Prohibition. So, Prohibition is when alcohol is banned or not allowed. And a fun fact is the 18th Amendment is actually the only amendment ever in United States history to be repealed by another amendment. So they passed the 18th Amendment and banned alcohol, and then eventually we get to the 21st Amendment, and that says the 18th Amendment is no longer valid, alcohol is now allowed, which is why we see it today in the United States. So what was the significance or the importance of the temperance movement? The important thing here is women saw that they would be able to make a change in the government. They fought for the banning of alcohol. They were able to pass an amendment. So if they could lead a movement to ban alcohol, why not lead a movement to get the right to vote? And we're going to see that that's what they did, which is awesome because obviously as a woman, it is amazing to see that these people were able to fight for something like the right to vote and for women to get involved in the government. And it's a step away from women being seen as property. I hope you enjoyed this. It's definitely an interesting thing, and we will be learning next about women's suffrage. Thanks.